Hi, I'm Rigger, and it's been a year. I acknowledge that, and I'm not sure if anyone is left to even watch this series, but we're gonna give it a go. I know you probably want answers from me, so here's what we'll do. Let's get straight into the episode, and we'll talk about what's going on at the end. So if you're interested, it's there, but let's do this whole thing first. Also, please throw me a like, share it, subscribe, and comment if you're still on board for this, because the algorithm will absolutely punish me for this horrible delay. Cheers! For a reminder, what happened last time is that we had a huge fight at Haven that went much worse than it did originally. Sadly, Callie Belladonna was killed by Adam. Cinder was stabbed all the way through the hip and sliced through her side, but she did manage to escape as she flew away in a ball of fire. Nora got knocked out and was in bandages last time, but seemed to be okay. Weiss had her hair chopped short, lost her tiara, and was impaled all the way through her thigh. Last we saw her was at Carly's funeral, where she was in a wheelchair with a big bandage on her leg. The team got the lamp as usual, but they didn't see a vision of Salem this time. Afterwards, when Weiss was being tended to in hospital, Pyrrha sat alone outside the room where she was handed back her spear after it had been removed from Weiss's leg, and she seemed to be ashamed of it. Mercury, Emerald, and Hazel escaped, and got a call directing them to meet up with Dr. Watson Tyrion at a ship where they discovered the unconscious, bandaged-up Cinder. They all fled the scene together. Blake and Yang still have not had a chance to properly speak, but at the funeral for Carly and others who perished, a silent confrontation where Yang finally approached Blake did occur, but she didn't know what to say, instead eventually just hugging her close as Blake burst out into tears on her shoulder while Sun watched from a distance. And finally, a mysterious detective arrived at the destroyed school and found Weiss's tiara in the rubble, but after sneaking away, it was revealed to be Neo in disguise, and she seems to be hot on their tail. Now, let's get into the story. We open on a flashback. It's a cool, dark night above Haven Academy. Slowly, as the camera pans down from the stars to the courtyard, we see glowing flames as gunshots and shouts start to ring out into the night sky. Amidst the chaos, suddenly, from the roof of the building, a flaming ball shoots high into the air, streaking through the night like a meteor as if it was returning back up to the heavens, accompanied by a bellowing growl. Reaching a high point far above, the flaming figure seems to hover for a moment and looks around. From their vantage point high above the scene, they spot a ship in a small clearing off in the distance on an adjacent hill. With a grunt of effort, the flames flare up again and the figure begins shooting across the sky, careening in an arc aimed directly for that ship. As they approach, the details of that clearing come into focus. As they draw nearer and nearer, the figure of a man leaning against that ship can be made out briefly, before the burning wreck of a person crashes down short of their destination and lands in a tumbling heap on the near side of the clearing. After that graceless tumbling across the grass, an animalistic, growling, rage-filled snarl is heard, and the figure drags itself to its feet. The disheveled, bloody figure of Cinder stumbles, clothes still dotted with flames and trailing smoke. Her eyes burn with rage as she begins limping towards the ship across the clearing. Within only a few steps, though, she begins clutching her hip in agony. Looking down, she sees the entire side of her dress soaked through with blood, as the gigantic slice carved all the way through her side continues to drain her of life. With another beastly snarl of frustration and rage, her eyes light up in maiden flames as they suddenly burst forth, and she summons flames to her hand. She pauses for just a brief second before committing, and with a scream of determination, she clamps both hands down on her hip, front and back, as she shrieks in ear-splitting pain, holding her hands in position as long as she can as she sears the wounds closed. As the orange glowing burns of handprints on her side sickeningly fade, she attempts to walk again. She only lasts a few moments before slumping down to basically a crouch. With more grunts of pain, she sets her sights towards the feet of the ship that she can see, and begins crawling towards it through the dirt. She scrambles along the ground furiously until a pair of legs come into view, belonging to whoever was still leaning against their ship. With a final grunt, now close enough to reach out and touch the person's shoes, Cinder's eyes light up again in flickering and weak flames as she conjures a ball of fire to her hand with the last of her strength. With effort, she looks up at the man she's about to kill, and upon doing so, sees the smug sneer of Dr. Watts looking down on her. "You," is all Cinder manages to hiss before the flames extinguish, her eyes go out, and she collapses face down in the dirt at his feet. A menacing giggle can be heard from inside the ship, and Tyrion leans out the door. Yes, pitiful, isn't it? Go inside and fetch me the med kit. Be a shame if she died of infection before we get to see whatever Salem will do to her. Tyrion openly laughs and nods, heading back inside to find it. From there's a brief montage from Cinder's perspective. She comes to for a moment to see Emerald right in her face asking her something as she's being dragged up the ramp onto the ship. There's faint sounds of arguing too as Cinder's vision swims in and out of focus before going black. Next, she awakens to see a small room. It's some run-down old place that looks abandoned. She's on a table. A big chunk of the midsection of her dress has been cut away. Bloody tools are in a dish nearby. Her head lolls to the side to see a makeshift IV with a bag of blood and another bag of fluids hung from a hat rack. She also sees one other person. It's Emerald again, sitting by her in an uncomfortable-looking dining chair. She has her head down, not having noticed Cinder's movement and moment of consciousness, and almost immediately, Cinder blacks out again. Her consciousness doesn't return until sometime later as a loud sound brings her back to the waking world. It's a big creaking sound and then a bang, as if the world's oldest door was roughly opened. She's in the same place on the same table, but the time of day is very different. There's now sun streaking in. In fact, it looks like a late afternoon. There's no indication of how long has actually passed, but she can hazily see Mercury and Emerald sitting together near her in chairs, and Watts is leaning against a bench in the far corner of the room just looking at his scroll. They've all just turned to look at something. Loud footsteps herald the arrival of Hazel into her blurry vision, as he seemingly just arrived in the room. "I got them. We can go." Her vision goes blurry again, but she hears, "It's about time. How about we get out of here already?" And her blurry vision moves on its own, as if someone unseen has started moving her off the table. Another deranged low cackle indicates it must be Tyrion, and Cinder blacks out once again. Cut to the house at Haven, with everyone sat around the lamp, listening to Ozpin's explanation of what it can do, and his lie that all of the questions have been used. As the camera pans around, we're reminded of the various injuries of the team. Nora seems to be okay, with her bandages having been removed, but Weiss is still in a wheelchair. She tentatively moves her leg uncomfortably and winces in pain as she does so. Ruby is sitting on the floor beside the table, looking at the lamp with a little bit of wonder, and notably, Blake and Yang are sitting across the room from each other. Pyrrha is sitting quietly, not saying much. Nora is indeed back to normal, as she has her same usual comedic outburst about using the various questions. The lingering tension between Pyrrha and Ren seems to have somewhat subsided as they're sitting near each other, but it's difficult to say. Everything seems to be as usual, until Crow mentions the plan, which is to head to Argus, at which Pyrrha silently recoils a little, but doesn't say anything. Instead, slowly looking down and adjusting the edges of her travelling cloak, which she's wearing once again. The hood isn't up, but it looks like she may wish to do so. No one notices Pyrrha apparently being uncomfortable, though, as their attention is quickly taken with the subject of Weiss getting them into the military base and up to Atlas. Weiss, who looks a bit of a mess in her wheelchair with her bandaged leg and her hair still roughly cut and uneven, admits that she's unsure about how well that will work, that she has no idea of her status in Atlas right now with how she left everything, and agrees to go along with it, but doesn't want people to get their hopes up. Pro says that it's simply their best option, so it better work, and tells everyone to go finish packing and getting their bags because they have to go soon. Cut to Blake in the back courtyard, leaning on the rail, looking out quietly over the view. It's not like she ever unpacked in Mistral anyway, so she doesn't have anything to pack. She's lost in thought, her expression hard to read, but her eyes are slightly downcast. As she stares out into the distance, her cat ears twitch at a sound, and she instinctively spins around, jolting with panic, clearly a lot more on edge than what she was letting on. A startled Ruby jumps back and puts her hands up in front of herself. "Whoa! Sorry." Blake pauses, before realizing what she was even doing, and then she looks up and we pull out to see her hand was hovering halfway to her weapon. She quickly puts her hands down and looks very awkward. "Ruby, it's you. She sighs and seems deflated. "I'm sorry, Ruby. I'm just..." And she motions with her hands vaguely, but clearly can't put words to her feelings. Ruby, having regained her composure, finishes walking up to her. "Hey, it's okay. He wouldn't stand a chance. Not with all of us here." Ruby slowly puts a comforting hand on Blake's shoulder, who nods quietly. After a contemplative silence, Blake decides to change the subject. What can I help you with, Ruby?" Ruby perks up, remembering she did indeed come out here for a reason. "I just wanted to ask, how'd everything go with your dad?" Blake looks a little disappointed that the conversation wasn't something entirely different, but she nods again. Well, not great. He's still determined to form and lead a new group. He wants to make sure everyone who is left is safe, and then get back to trying to make a real difference. He said that's what Mum would have wanted. Honestly, I think the fact he's doing it in her name is the only thing keeping him going. I wish I was there more, I wish I could help him, but I'm not really sure what I can do." "Yeah, I remember," Ruby mutters. Blake looks a little quizzical at that response, before it dawns on her that Ruby must have been talking about when she lost her own mother. Despite how young she was at the time, surely it stuck with her, and Blake nods again. "We're so happy to have you back, Blake, but I just wanted to say, we'd understand if you..." No. I'm sticking with you guys. We have to get the relic to safety, and my dad is safer away from all of this." Ruby nods at that response and gives Blake a quick little hug. "Alright, well, come on. We have to go soon." And she starts heading back inside. Blake doesn't move, but instead looks down with a sigh. "Safer away from me." She gathers herself up to go follow Ruby, and sees Yang standing in the doorway across the courtyard. They meet eyes for a second, and it's unclear how long Yang has been there, watching. However, Ruby arrives at the door first and begins speaking to Yang, and takes her attention away as the pair head inside, leaving Blake to follow along after. Later, at the train station, things go as they usually do, except Weiss is in her wheelchair, who is being playfully pushed around by Ruby. Yang and Ruby still joke about the gift shop, and Pyrrha once again has her big cloak on with her hood up and silently stands beside Ren and Nora. Off to the side, though, things are slightly more awkward between Ilya and Blake. "I know you have your friends, but are you sure you'll be alright? Adam is still... It's alright. I'm safer with them than I would be staying in one place." Ilya sniffs, trying to hold back her emotions. "Doesn't sit right with me. I still owe you for everything. I want to help." Blake reaches out and takes her hand. "Ilya, you're helping more than you know. You are the symbol of the fight against Adam's way and the importance of this new movement. Not only did you pull away from Adam, you saved the communications tower. You saved many people at Haven. Despite everything that's still a win that we desperately need. You're a symbol of how important it is that faunus and humans work together to stop people like Adam. Things would have been so much worse without us, without you. At that, Ilya looks down, again trying to hide her emotions, clearly unsure how to process all of this praise, and it swirls mixing with her other feeling. Ilya, you deserve to be called a hero, along with all of the others, and my father needs you. Since I can't be there, then you need to be. Please, look after him for me. At that, Ilya nods more assuredly. She grips tighter onto Blake's hand. I will. I promise. Ilya pauses, not letting go. Ilya? Sorry, it's just parting ways, not knowing how long it'll be before I see you again. It hurts, just like last time. I know, but we will see each other again. And when we do, we'll both have done more good than we ever thought was possible. Deal? Ilya nods and leans in for a hug. Deal. Ilya lets go of Blake and looks past her, seeing who's behind her, and politely backs away. Blake turns around to see Sun and Neptune. Neptune is actually standing off to the side, and the tone is quite solemn. He actually walks up first and gives Blake a one-armed, quick little hug. It's good to see you, Blake, is all that he says before he quickly moves off to the side, quietly. Clearly he'd been informed of everything that had happened and was leaving space for Sun and Blake to speak privately. After that, it is Sun that approaches. By now, I'm sure you're sick of people asking you about your decision. I'm not here to get you to change your mind. Blake actually cracks a smirk and a nod of thanks. But before you go, I do have something that I need to say. There's a look of curiosity and brief apprehension at that. But Blake waits and listens. Going with you to Menagerie, you facing going home, you reuniting with your team. It's what inspired me to do the same. But before that happens, I just wanted you to know. He makes sure to lock eyes with her. She's very unsure what's about to come next. If you ask me, I'll go with you. Right now. Blake doesn't know how to respond. After what happened, I couldn't live with myself if the same thing happened to you. Just ask. My team will understand. I'm sure they'd be happy to try and come along too, even. He doesn't say something. It's not that I don't have faith in you, in all of you, but you still need all the help you can get, and me just going home isn't helping. Besides, I've got a score to settle with Adam too. Blake looks over her shoulder to where Ilya and Neptune are standing out of earshot, and back to Sun. She looks at him again. Thank you. She glances down over the railing to see her team on the platform below. You're not wrong that we could use the help, but you should be with your team. A faint, hopeful smile that had formed dropped off Sun's face, but he seems to have expected this answer. And it's not just you going home. You're going to Vacuo so you can warn them to prepare, so something like Haven doesn't happen again. We'll do the same for Atlas. It's our best option. That, and I wouldn't deny you the chance to see everyone you care about again. Despite how it ended, I'll forever be grateful that I spent that time with my family. You should do the same, because we never know what might happen. Sun pauses, but accepts this answer. He nods more firmly to reassure her. And, Sun, I am so glad that you were there with me. And she hugs him tightly. She even leans in and kisses him on the cheek. Until next time. See you then. And with that, they part ways. Though as Blake steps away from the platform below, we see that once again, Yang was watching. On the train, we see Weiss enter their cabin alone, rolling in. She stops by the bunks and laboriously pushes herself up to her feet and takes 2 good steps across the room, but stumbles on the third with a wince. She catches herself on the top bunk and lowers herself to sit on the side of her bed. As she looks at her leg annoyed, she hears the cabin door open once again, and Blake peeks in. "Oh, what are you doing here?" Weiss motions to the chair. "Ruby was asked to stop racing me up and down the train cars, and I escaped while she and Nora were arguing with the guy." That earns a chuckle from Blake, who enters the room, closing the door behind her. "What about you? Who are you hiding from?" Blake pauses. No one, actually. I'm glad you're here. I want to help." Weiss tilts her head quizzically. Blake motions to wait a second and goes over to her bag and digs around for something, and comes back with a small bag clutched in her hand. "It's just, I was on the road a lot by myself," and she lifts up a small pair of scissors. "True, I mostly just let it grow, but I had to clean it up a little bit here and there." She tilts the scissors questioningly. It takes Weiss a moment to realize what she means, and when she does, she runs her hand over her own roughly cut hair, having totally forgotten about it seems. "I've never known your hair to not be perfect, unless this is a new look for you." It's Weiss's turn to chuckle. "No, I just can't believe I didn't notice. I guess there were just more important things," putting emphasis on that last point since she was talking to Blake. Blake nods and motions for Weiss to turn away from her on the bed, and sits down behind her, taking some hair between her fingers and starts to lightly snip at it. "Yeah, well, we can't have our Ice Queen looking like a commoner." "Oh, I don't know. I've met some pretty great commoners." Blake actually breaks out into a proper smile behind Weiss, as the camera pulls out through the glass window and we fade out. Elsewhere in the train, the remaining team members are talking about what to do in Argus. As they do, though, Pyrrha, still in full cloak and hood, moves away from the group and sits alone in an empty booth. Unexpectedly, though, a moment later, it's Ren who sits down in the seat across from her. Pyrrha looks over to him questioningly. "Do you want to talk about it?" "About what?" Ren glances back over his shoulder to the assembled team, still mid-conversation, and then back to Pyrrha, just to highlight how far she separated herself from everyone. Pyrrha sighs, realizing it's very obvious how bothered she is. "Alright." But as Pyrrha begins to give her answer, we cut away, not getting to hear it. Back in the room, Yang and Ruby walk in mid-conversation with each other and see Blake and Weiss sitting beside each other on the edge of the bed. Weiss is holding up a hand mirror and examining herself, and the scissors are still in Blake's hand. The haircut isn't a dramatic change from what it was, but it had cleaned up all of the roughly cut areas. Rather than being roughly hacked off and hanging at odd lengths, it now cleanly and smoothly draped, just a little longer than her shoulders, with a little bit of extra length at the back. Her bangs too had been similarly cleaned up, now more smoothly framing the edges of her face, in a fashion to match the rest of the haircut. It was a great improvement over the rough, sawn-off mess that it was. "Oh, that looks great!" Ruby cheers as she rushes over, leaving Blake and Yang to hold each other's gaze for a moment across the room, but neither say anything. Ruby grabs their attention again. "Oh, I'm not sure if you'll want this now, but I got you something too." As she too rummages around, and after a moment produces that bag from the train station gift shop that she had earlier. "It's, not a tiara, but the best I could do." And she reaches into the bag and takes out just a plain, thin, red headband. She holds it out with a shrug, not really expecting much of a reaction. "It's fine if you don't want it." Ruby is surprised when Weiss almost snatches it from her hands. She smoothly puts it on, tucking it behind her ears to keep the bulk of her open hair back and out of her eyes, whilst leaving the front untouched. She raises a hand mirror again, styling it in place, and nods to herself. Perfect. The team share a collective smile before the car violently rocks. This is where Crow bursts into the room and tells them to grab their weapons. They hurriedly do and move to leave, but when Weiss pushes herself to her feet and begins to walk across the room, she makes it about 3 steps before wincing and having to hold the doorway. I'm not sure that's a good idea. Weiss scowls, but motions for them to run on ahead. Another bang from the outside sparks them to do so as they rush off, as Weiss looks disapprovingly at the empty wheelchair rocking around in the middle of the cabin. On top of the train, the battle begins, and it plays out much like it does regularly. One of the hired huntsmen is taken out immediately before everyone else has the chance to engage. There's a scramble as everyone begins taking on various Grimm. Ren and Nora work together exceptionally well. Oscar has notably improved, Crow is of course excellent, and Ruby seems to be physically recovered after the events of Haven. Blake and Yang, however, things are a little different. Initially, they fight separately. However, mid-fight, they begin executing some teamwork, like an old pattern they fall into without even speaking. However, a moment after they finish cutting off the head of a Grimm, they have a moment and share a glance. But rather than a quip or a smile, there's just an awkward pause before they look around and find a new opponent each to engage with separately. Pyrrha, for her part, is making short work of any Grimm who comes into range. If anything, she seems to be taking her frustration out on them, more aggression in her attacks than usual. Ruby looks around, seeing no end to the approaching Grimm in sight. Suddenly, one of the manticores above pitches down and flies directly towards her. She readies Crescent Rose and braces for impact, when out of nowhere, it's blindsided by an icy blast. A moment later, the unmistakable image of Weiss atop her Queen Lancer streaks through the sky. She takes up position, hovering over the train, and readies Mertnaster in her hand as she begins launching projectiles at the Grimm. At first, Ruby smiles, seeing Weiss finding a way to partake in the battle. However, quickly it turns to concern as a roar from the commanding Sphinx sends several manticores straight at Weiss, and they begin firing volleys of breath attacks and attempting to dive at the summon as it hovers over the train. Weiss nimbly dodges one, but a second causes her to have to roll quickly in midair, almost throwing herself off of her summon. A clear look of panic flashes across her face as she starts to lose control, and barely deflects an incoming attack using a glyph to shunt her and her summon sideways roughly through the air. High in the sky, away from anyone's immediate help. It is now at the worst time when the call rings out. Tunnel! Weiss looks behind her, now terrified as indeed a tunnel is rapidly approaching, and in a moment she'd be left alone in the air as the teams were carried away with the train. She turns the Lancer in mid-air, disregarding the Grimm, and makes a beeline for the train carriages down below, speeding down as fast as she can, recklessly fast. Seeing this, Ruby equally begins sprinting towards the back of the train across the roofs of the cabins. Everything else has stopped mattering, as she keeps her eyes glued on the approaching Weiss streaking down from the skies as she sprints across the trains, leaping over gaps and attempting to outrun the rapidly approaching roof of the tunnel behind her, almost as if it were chasing her down with murderous intent. Just as it seems like there's a good chance Weiss will make it to the last gap in the carriages, she's suddenly rocked as a chasing breath attack from one of the Grimm hits its mark, and to her horror, the Lancer evaporates, and Weiss begins to freefall. Having lost her forward momentum, she's falling directly down, and while she might make the back of the train, at this speed she'd do nothing but violently bounce off its tail and be left laying on the tracks. She screams in fear and surprise, having almost no time to think. The top of the train car seems to be only a breath away as she falls face first, her nose almost hitting the top of the roof. Panic and horror fill her eyes that this is her end, before a rush overtakes her and she's swept up in a pedal berth that sharply loops over the back of the train and reforms at the last moment, leaving Ruby hanging on to the handle of Crescent Rose, which is slammed into the back of the train with one hand and holding on to Weiss with the other. Both of them dangle from the roof of the speeding train, being pulled along through the tunnel as it overtakes them from above. Ruby's brows are furrowed as she clutches on as hard as she can, one hand holding the train, one hand holding Weiss, who is panicked and clutching onto her, as both of them dangle from the back of the speeding carriage. Weiss, the panic still clear on her face but slowly becoming aware of where she is, takes stock of the back door of the train, but grimaces in frustration seeing it and the windows strongly secured by a crisscrossing lattice of the security system. Weiss impotently kicks at the door, not only hurting her leg, but the twisting motion causes Ruby to grunt in effort as she struggles to keep her hold on the back of the train. Suddenly, there's a huge booming crash on the other side of the door, and the double doors buckle outwards towards them. They hear a roar of effort and it buckles again even more with another booming impact. Then, bizarrely, one of the almost destroyed doors takes on a life of its own. It folds and buckles on itself, warping with a horrible squeal of tearing metal before it flings itself away down onto the tracks. Behind the door stands Pyrrha, hand outstretched, controlling her semblance, and beside her is Nora with her hammer in hand. Pyrrha reaches out and pulls Weiss inside, and a moment later another pair of hands pull in Ruby too. That is revealed to be Crow as they all spill back into the cabin, everyone panting with effort and relief. Back inside, after recovering, they all confront the other huntsman, whose arm is still broken and there's not much they can do about it. He remains pretty hostile and slumps in a booth in pain. He rants about the importance of the defenses, but when he flashes the scroll at them, Crow just snatches it from him and turns off the turrets himself, ignoring his protest. Turning back, the team talk over what to do next as Oz reveals the fact that the Grimm are attracted to the relics. The news is not taken well. Pyrrha, for once, not having her cloak on, can't hide her scowl at the news. Eventually, Ruby steps up, pointing out that it doesn't matter right now. They need a plan and they need to help people, and suggests splitting up. Protests and arguments flare up before Crow steps in and says that Ruby is right. There's silence for a moment before it's actually Wren who steps up to ask the next question. Well, then who stays and who goes? Ruby tilts her head quizzically. My team can go with the lamp and we'll meet you guys, and then she stops when Rice rolls herself forward into the circle with a sigh, having been placed back in her recovered wheelchair. No, wait. And Ruby leans down and puts her hand on Weiss's shoulder. I said we wouldn't leave your side again, remember? Weiss nods and shrugs. It's okay, Ruby. She looks up at her and then to the rest of her team, clearly upset at the idea, but Weiss sighs and continues. In a few days, I'll be fine. By the time you get to Argus, I'll be on my feet, and until then, I can still use my summons to guard the train. This makes sense. Ruby looks concerned. Are you sure? She nods reassuringly at Ruby. Then Pyrrha steps forward. I'd like to go with you. And Pyrrha pointedly looks over at Oscar as she says it, her stern look somewhat softening from what it was before when Ozpin was in control. Nora steps up. What? We are your team, you know. But it's Wren who quickly jumps in front of her, putting his hands up to stop Nora before she goes off on a rant. Wait. He turns to look at Pyrrha, and they hold each other's gaze for a moment, with a nod of understanding from Wren. Pyrrha is one of the best at fighting Grimm that we have. We need to make sure that the lamp is safe if they're truly going to be coming after it. And in order to separate the train and keep the passengers safe, we need all the Grimm chasing them and the lamp, so that they lose focus on everyone else. You, me, and Weiss should be more than enough to take out any stragglers that follow. After that, we just have to stay on guard and hope for a quiet journey to Argus. It's the safest option. Nora furrows her brows, clearly unhappy, but waves it off annoyed and walks away. The others look a little awkward at the whole thing before Crow cuts the tension. Alright, that's settled. Go round up the passengers and pack what you can carry. Go. As everyone moves off to do just that, and Pyrrha and Wren stay behind. Pyrrha sighs once everyone has cleared away. Thank you. Wren nods and glances behind himself to check the others are out of earshot. You can't delay it forever. Pyrrha nods a few times knowingly, and Pyrrha hands him a small piece of paper. Ren takes it and glances at it and nods and tucks it away. At that, Pyrrha puts out her arm, and Ren clasps her hand, pulling them together in a brief one-armed hug, seeming to have finally come to an understanding. See you there. After moving the people as far forward as possible, Blake waits for the call to cut to carriages, while Ruby and Rice appear at the destroyed very back door of the train. Right as the train passes the tunnel exit, Weiss aims Mertenmaster and summons a huge sheet of ice that plugs up the tunnel. That done, Ruby grabs her and pedal bursts through the cabins to drop her off at the waiting arms of Nora and Ren. That done, Ruby turns around and runs back through the train towards the back and shouts as she approaches the waiting Blake, who decouples the train with time for Ruby to jump across the gap. Looking up, Blake is taken aback by a sight of Adam across the train from her, but the image seems to vanish a moment later when she looks back. Blake swings around and climbs up to the roof where Ruby, Crow, Pyrrha, Yang, and Oscar are stood, waiting. Everyone except Oscar with their weapons up, aiming at the ice wall. A moment later, it bursts open as Grim breath attacks force it to explode, and the Grim themselves begin pouring out. Everyone with a ranged weapon just begins firing and unloading at the bottleneck of the tunnel mouth to do as much damage as possible before they get free and take to the skies. The barrage of shots clearly does some damage and takes out a few, but it isn't long before the train speeds them away from the hole, and the Grim have room to take to the air once again. Ruby looks behind them to check that the other half of the train is steadily speeding away from them, the huntsmen and passengers quietly hiding inside to make as little spectacle of themselves as possible, whilst all of the noise and distraction comes from the team remaining behind. It seems to work, be it the huge amount of combatants or the attraction to the lamp, but either way, the majority of the Grim seem fixated on the severed train car, allowing the others to escape. Ruby breathes a sigh of relief, spotting one lone Grim that seems to be trailing the other train, but is sure that those aboard can deal with it handily. Reassured, she turns her attention back to the fight. Everyone is handling their fights well. The only one who seems to be tiring out is Oscar. But luckily for him, Pyrrha is doing most of the heavy lifting, as she spears and slashes manticores to shreds in defense of him. The only real trouble comes when the Sphinx lands, as it manages to keep the teams at bay, sending huge gusts with its wings. Blake uses Gamble Shroud to swing around the train behind it, as Yang does the same using her gauntlets to fire past it, and they begin approaching it from behind, getting past its wall of wind. Once behind it, they begin slowly approaching from the back, peppering it with shots, as Crow and Ruby equally approach it from the front, slashing at it with their blades. As the four of them close in on the behemoth, Pyrrha looks around, noticing the rest of the Grim seem to have been dealt with, and feels a little safer leaving Oscar alone to go and help the others defeat this last beast. However, as Pyrrha approaches, at the worst possible moment, the Grim, feeling threatened from all sides, leaps into the sky and attempts to dive over everyone, heading straight for Oscar, who is alone at the front end of the carriage. Yang and Blake, in a panic, leap after it. Blake catches on to its snake tail that bites at her as she dodges and twists, holding on to it with one hand. Yang had fired her gauntlets down at the train to blast her into the sky as she lands on the Sphinx's back. Pyrrha had turned on her heels and has begun running back to Oscar to try and get in the way to protect him, but he's in the open. She won't make it in time. The Sphinx rears back to blast down at Oscar with fire, when at the last moment, Yang blast punches it in the back of the neck, at the same time that Blake flails her sword and manages to decapitate the snake on the tail. In pain, the Sphinx shrieks and the fireball misses going high, but blows apart the track ahead. The shrieking Sphinx spirals at a low altitude, with Yang and Blake still holding on for dear life, as Yang keeps punching at it in the sky. Pyrrha keeps sprinting towards Oscar at the tip of the train. Right as the carriage hits the lip, Oscar is flung up into the air, but Pyrrha leaps onto him to catch him. In desperation, with no other option, she reaches out with her hands as if trying to pull the carriage to them with her semblance. Pyrrha pumps whatever she has left into her aura, and we see the train car being affected, but rather than changing its crashing trajectory, instead it's Pyrrha that is magnetically pulled down towards the roof of the train and sticks to it, somewhat crushing Oscar underneath her as she pins his body down, sticking him to the roof of the carriage as it launches off the side of the hill and into the snow. A crow can be seen overhead as he was left with no choice but to jump and transform, and a burst of petals streaks from the roof, depositing Ruby roughly in the snowbank, only saved by luck when the carriage roars past her head, missing her by inches as it comes to its final resting place. Looking up with a groan, Ruby sees the Sphinx still spiraling overhead, twisting out of the sky and shrieking in pain, as Yang is essentially punching it down from the heavens. It eventually crashes into the snow with a big white puff before its body starts evaporating as Yang pulls herself up from the snow. And Blake appears beside her a moment later, having used the momentum change of her semblance to essentially bounce down from the sky, the pair ending up shoulder to shoulder next to their impressive kill. On the train, there's a sound of a magnetic release and Pyrrha tumbles from the roof. She lands on her back in the snow and takes a moment to collect herself, looking at her hands. That's new. But she's relieved when she sees the figure of Oscar above her stand up from the roof unharmed before hopping down. From there, things continue as usual, with Maria making her appearance, Ruby finds a lamp which flew off Oscar as they crashed, and the same argument as usual occurs. Oscar warns them about Oz being duplicitous and then starts resisting Ozpin, and ultimately Jin is summoned. When the team pull weapons to stop Crow, Pyrrha is decidedly doing nothing. She stands with Ruby, Yang, and Blake but doesn't draw her weapon, just standing like a wall between Oz and Ruby. She also gives Ruby a reassuring nod when prompted for a question by Jin. Ruby asks what Oz is hiding for them, and we go into the Lost Fable. Obviously, that continues as normal. However, of note, when Ozma is talking to the God of Light in the White Void after being resurrected, we see Pyrrha's point of view watching events. Her face of confusion and curiosity begins to harden. She looks very angry, but it gives way to tears as they silently roll down her cheek. She takes a moment to wipe them with a pinch of her nose, before setting herself again, arms folded, to listen to what the God of Light explains about the relics. As they all finally leave the vision and it clears, we hear Yang exclaim about Salem being immortal. Everyone is slightly shocked because this is now the first time they've actually seen Salem, and it was still only in her much less intimidating form. Ruby asks what his plan is, and he admits to not having one, and Crow punches him, giving his speech. However, before Oz can retreat, people turn to Pyrrha, expecting a response with how protective she's been of Oscar after Crow punched him. But upon turning, we see Pyrrha staring at Oz, furious. Why did you get to come back? There's somewhere to go? Somewhere to come back from? You've been there, and you didn't tell me? And she marches forward to grab at Oz angrily when Ruby and Yang have to physically get in her way and hold her back. You don't say anything? You just recruit people to an unwinnable war, and you lie, and you lie, and you lie, and you let people suffer for your secrets? You don't tell anyone anything after all we give to you. How dare you? Not even an hint of comfort. She's feebly clawing at him as she stops and drops to her knees, so Ruby and Yang can stop physically restraining her. However, as Pyrrha's words click, Yang looks over to Blake, who has also been silent. She's standing quietly in the snow. She looks stunned, wide-eyed. It seems the same revelation has hit Pyrrha that is hitting her, about her mother. Her face too forms a glowering stare of anger straight towards Oscar, though she doesn't move, just letting the cold wind blow past her icy expression. It's at that Oscar speaks up, saying that Oz has gone. Yang protests, but there's nothing he can do. Maria steps in as usual and starts directing traffic. As the miserable bunch begin collecting supplies, Yang walks up to Blake, who still hasn't moved. She's about to speak, but Blake turns and marches off, clearly not ready to talk about it. After Ruby's failed attempt to cheer up Oscar and Crow's harsh words, Oscar himself looks over to his protector, Pyrrha, still kneeling in the snow. He walks over tentatively. "Are you okay? I didn't know. I swear, Pyrrha slowly gets up. She doesn't say anything. She just pats Oscar on the shoulder reassuringly and walks away back to the wreckage. Cut to Evernight Castle as the ship arrives. The doors open as Hazel, Watts, and Tyrion step out. Behind them is Cinder, who is being held upright by Mercury and Emerald on either side. She looks incredibly rough, barely able to walk, and with a mean red scarring of a handprint front and back over her hip, the seared flesh visible through the roughly torn away half of the midsection of her dress, as well as a maskless, scarred face missing an eye. Mercury is also somewhat uncomfortable with the grim arm around his shoulders as they work to essentially drag Cinder up the staircase. Entering Salem's main hall, the tone is incredibly tense. Dr. Watts and Tyrion immediately move halfway up the room towards the silent, unmoving Salem to stand away from the Haven attack crew. However, after that, everyone becomes still, waiting, as the silent Salem sits at the head of the table, expressionless. The air hangs quietly for a long time. "Tyrion." The collective room flinches somewhat as the silence is broken, and Salem turns unexpectedly to look at him first. "I'm glad to see you're doing well." Her eyes narrow at the new scars on his body. "Apologies for my absence, my queen. Crow Branwen, and he pauses as Salem waves a hand, clearly brushing off any further explanation. She seems to have bigger issues on her mind. Slowly, Salem's gaze turns to look at the four at the far end. There's more silence before Hazel sighs, and he steps forward to speak, but stops as Salem stands up. She glides slowly down the length of the table towards them, making them wait. As she approaches, Hazel decides to take a knee and looks down out of respect. She stops and looks down at him. "I apologize, ma'am." She doesn't speak, but she slowly glides up to Mercury, and he quickly follows Hazel's lead, dropping down to one knee, letting Cinder's grim arm drop away and hang freely. "I'm sorry." Without a word, Salem skips over Cinder, who's now just dangling from Emerald's one shoulder. Instead, Salem looks to Emerald, locking eyes with her too. There's a pause as Salem's eyes bore into Emerald's, as she slowly begins leaning closer and closer, more menacingly. Emerald's nerve too gives out, and her knees buckle as she too drops to the ground. "I'm sorry!" And the sudden drop causes Cinder to pitch forward. Her legs have no hope of keeping her up as her knees bounce painfully off the floor. The twisting motion pulls her arm completely free of Emerald as she fails to hold on, and Cinder slumps forward, painfully face down against the floor at Salem's feet. Muffled groans of anguish sound against the floor. "I didn't quite hear that." There's another muffled groan from Cinder, her face still pressed to the stone. Suddenly, grim arms rush up from the floor, roughly grabbing around Cinder's head and dragging her up to eye level, as more hold her arms and torso immobile. Salem leans in, almost nose to nose with Cinder, her eyes burning with rage. "I'm sorry." Cinder struggles to say it through gritted teeth. She's uncomfortably clamped by the arms up out of the floor. The Grim let Cinder's arms drop free. "All is forgiven. Just hand over the relic." She waits with a hand outstretched, obviously knowing that Cinder doesn't have it. Cinder hangs there, pathetically. "Well, if you didn't get it, surely you were able to gain some more power to help us get it back." She looks expectantly at Cinder again, seeming it pretty clear she knows she didn't get the powers either. Cinder continues to hang there suspended and useless. It seems to me like the only thing you brought with you is failure! She raises a finger and points it directly in Cinder's face. Once again, you crawl back to me in pieces. Once again, you don't have the relic. Once again, you expect me to pick you back up. And her finger suddenly sharply points down at Emerald, who flinches. Give me one good reason why I shouldn't just have her replace you right now. At least she can walk back in here. For the girl who wanted power, you're so weak. And without warning, the hands retract, and Cinder is left to fall back against the hard floor with another painful crash and whimper. Salem turns away, taking a slow breath. At the pause, Hazel stands up. Ma'am. She looks over threateningly, but waits. We know where they're going. They've boarded the Argus Limited. Atlas, she says to herself, and looks over at Dr. Watts. He just does a small bowing gesture. I would be happy to recover it for you, ma'am. There is a shuffling sound and a grunt of pain. Salem turns to look at the disturbance, and to everyone's surprise, beyond all odds, Cinder has clawed her way up off the floor. Calling it standing would be generous. She's hunched over, shaky, her hands are dangling, she's breathing heavily and clearly struggling. I'll get it, she mumbles out. Salem's eyes narrow as she swoops closer. What did you say? I'll get it. I'll get the lamp. Salem looks away dismissively. And I'll get the powers. And I'll kill Ozpin. Salem looks back questioningly. Again. And it dawns on Salem, and she sharply looks at Hazel, who nods in confirmation. He's indeed back, ma'am. And Salem starts to seethe, and the room shakes. Ozpin and the relic. Salem suddenly snaps to attention. What? Tyrion, you will prepare Atlas for my arrival. Both look surprised and apprehensive at the idea, but both immediately nod. And you, she turns to look at Cinder, you three go as well. And if you return to me empty-handed one more time, it'll be the last thing you do. Cinder shrieks as her arm suddenly lashes round and burns. You can't run from me. Do you understand? Cinder nods, painfully kneeling against the ground. Ma'am, in her condition, what if she loses the... Salem raises a finger again to cut him off before pointing it directly in Cinder's face. Luckily for you, we have a replacement ready to go, and she turns her head, Cinder following her gaze to Emerald, who looks horrified at everything. Think of her. And then Salem slowly advances on Emerald, though hopefully it won't come to that, because you'll keep her safe, won't you, dear? Emerald looks past Salem to the snarling Cinder, before slowly nodding her head in fear at Salem. Good, because if Cinder should fail, and those powers don't go to you, it'll be your job to get them back. And she puts a menacing hand on Emerald's shoulder, before patting it gently and sweetly, and reaches down and helps Emerald to her feet, and smiles. There's another long pause as Cinder looks back and forth between Salem and Emerald. Salem and Emerald. Salem and Emerald. But that silence is broken. Now, get to it. At that, everyone packs up and leaves, except Hazel, who was not given a job. Salem slowly glides over to her window, looking out upon the grim and the landscape. Slowly Hazel approaches to stand beside Salem. Do you really think she'll be able to get it back? Salem doesn't answer the question, but gives a small smirk to herself. Having received no answer, Hazel gives a small bow, and he turns and leaves. Back to the team, and they have arrived at Brunswick Farm. Pyrrha has put her cloak and hood back on to protect from the snow. The team trudge inside the silent farm with Yang pushing Bumblebee. As usual, they head inside, though this time it's Pyrrha who finds the dead upstairs. She doesn't scream, but calls out to the others to come and see it. After checking the grounds, Crow tells them it's the same everywhere, and they come to the same conclusions that they do originally, that they have to stay. Yang stands up on her own and says she's going to check the barn, seemingly ignoring Crow's warning that no one goes anywhere alone. Oscar stays behind with Maria to get the fire going, and Ruby goes off to find food. With nothing to do and wanting to abide by Crow's warning, Pyrrha follows her. Out at the barn, Yang struggles to open the door before a second pair of hands appears. It's Blake, of course, who followed her out. They silently head inside. Yang heads to the back and gets her flash of Adam outside, and her hands start shaking. Blake runs up, thinking there's danger, but stops. Sorry. Still get flashes from that night. Blake looks down at Yang's shaking hand. Blake steps in and puts a hand on her shoulder. Yeah. Blake hangs her head, unsure of what to say. Adam has taken so much, destroyed so much. I'm sorry. And Yang looks over to see Blake, and her eyes have drifted to Yang's robotic arm. Yang actually flinches away a little, as if self-conscious. What do you mean? Adam, if it wasn't for me, then... Yang looks mad and steps up. Is that what this is about? And the prosthetic hand held up. What? Do I look destroyed to you now? Huh? And Blake is taken aback a little in shock. There's a very awkward pause in the air. Yang huffs, looking at the trailer, and then turns to walk out. No, Yang, wait, that's not what I meant. But she's already gone, out into the whipping winds outside. Blake slowly clutches her own arms to her chest, suddenly feeling very small. Outside in the howling winds, we see Yang trudging her way back to the house. She shakes her head. Stupid, she mutters to herself, symbolically slapping her own face as she continues back towards shelter. Back on the hunt for food, Ruby and Pyrrha come across the bar. She makes the same comment about her uncle is not doing well. Pyrrha nods, and before they move on, Pyrrha actually slumps down on one of the stools at the bar. Speaking of which, you're not doing well either. And she hops up on the stool next to Pyrrha. Pyrrha slowly drops her hood, leaning on the bar with one arm and letting her head rest on it. Ruby considers what to say. It's about Ozpin, right? Pyrrha huffs. She motions in the air with a hand. I knew he went from body to body, obviously. But Jin, what she showed us, Ozpin, didn't just jump around. He died. And he came back. He's been... And she motions off into space again, unsure of how to phrase it. He couldn't have told me that Jaune was somewhere? Or Blake, that her mother... How can you know and not say that? Not say that there is somewhere. That there's something. That they exist somehow. Ruby looks down at the floor. It's something she hadn't really stopped to consider with everything else. And images of her mother's grave flash in her mind. But that's a good thing, right? We'll see them again sometime. Pyrrha shrugs. I don't know how it works. Or if that's how it works. I don't know what anything is. I don't either. But he does. That's the point. Her anger flashes for a second as she slumps on her hand again. Silence hangs while the two ponder the infinite possibilities. Do you think they can see us, Ruby? Ruby looks over, and Pyrrha is looking directly up. Now that we know that they're there, you think they can see us? Honestly, I'd like to think so. And Pyrrha deflates a little as she stands up. Do you think they're proud of us? What? What do you mean? Of course they are. Pyrrha? She just looks down more, clenching her fists in front of her as she stares at them. If you're right, then they know when we've let them down, and when we fail them. And with that, Pyrrha leaves, walking through the house, leaving RWBY on her own. RWBY goes to follow, but doesn't know what to say, and instead, she presses on, finding the canned food and the cellar door. Later that night, we see that most of the group has gone to sleep. Maria, RWBY, and Pyrrha are soundly sleeping. Oscar too is asleep and has been given Pyrrha's cloak as a blanket. Crow is in his post by the window, lost in his own little world, unclear if he's asleep or not yet. Sitting by the fire, however, awake, is Blake, just staring into the flames as they crackle. Nightmares bother you too, huh? Blake glances over and it's Yang, who lowers herself down beside her to sit, cross-legged, facing the fire side by side. Blake looks confused. Yeah. Yang, listen, I'm sorry about... Yang holds up her hand to stop her. It's okay. I know, that's not what you meant. That wasn't fair of me. I'm just... Like I said, the nightmares get to me too. And it's not just when I'm asleep. And Blake nods knowingly. Yang glances at her own arm, but then back to Blake, to make it clear she's directing it at both of them, not just talking about herself. He has taken too much. From all of us. Blake looks down in shame. But that is not your fault. Do you hear me? What happened at Beacon is not your fault. This, waving her arm, is not your fault. And what happened to your mom is not your fault. Yang shuffles around to turn and sit facing Blake, and puts a hand on Blake's knee, encouraging her to turn and face her too. Now the two sit across from each other, lit from the side by the fire behind them, crackling away, a mirror to when they sat across each other on a desk at Beacon. I'm not telling you to let it go, Blake. Do you think I've just suddenly let go of what he did to me? Of course not. But if you keep blaming yourself for his actions, you'll never be free of him. And she sighs. Clearly, I'm not over it either. I'm not perfect. None of us are. But no one blames you. She reaches across the gap between them and puts her hand under Blake's chin, lifting it so that her gaze can meet Yang's and they can lock eyes. No matter what, I promise you, no one blames you. I do not blame you for this, motioning with her arm again. No one at Haven or Beacon blames you for anything that he did. And I promise you that your dad doesn't blame you either. Blake has slowly been welling tears, but one finally rolls its way down her cheek, glinting in the flickering firelight. But she nods. Yang looks back to the fire, and eventually turns her whole body back to sit facing it. Tell me, what was your mother like? Blake is taken off guard, but Yang just keeps staring into the fire. Blake takes a moment to collect herself, and then she too turns back to face the fire so they're sitting side by side again. She was amazing. Blake too stares ahead, getting lost in the flames as they flicker, and a small smile creeps onto her face at the fond memories. Everyone thought my dad was the strong one, but she held us all together. There was no problem too great that couldn't be solved as a family. Nothing that couldn't be sorted out with a good cup of tea. Nowhere was brighter than wherever she was. Her smiles and her hugs cleansed the soul. She was my mom. She was everything. And we see another small tear roll down her cheek. This time, it's Yang. She too is still staring straight ahead at the fire and lost in her own memories as she listens to Blake. Something breaks her concentration as she looks to the side in confusion, where Blake has leant her head against Yang's shoulder, resting it against her. The exhaustion of what they've done over the last day catching up with her. Yang doesn't say another word, instead wrapping her arm around Blake to lean her closer in and hold her supportively. They each remain silent as they stare into the flames side by side, just sat on the floor, lost in their own little worlds of reminiscing. And that's where we fade to black, as everyone is settled in for a good night's rest at Brunswick Farms. So, there we go. Things continue to change. Carly's death seems to have rippled and altered a fair bit. The dynamic between Blake, Ilya, and Sun all seems to have shifted. Everyone is a lot more unsure and serious than the original. Due to injury, Weiss had to begrudgingly sit out the journey on foot, but was replaced by Pyrrha, who seems determined to keep her promise to Oscar. It seems like Ren and Pyrrha have come to more of an understanding and are discussing something privately that they're not sharing, though Nora isn't taking Pyrrha's decisions too well, it seems. On the bright side, Weiss and Blake shared some quality time together, during which Weiss realized she hadn't even considered her appearance in quite a while, and got a new style to boot. The train crash still occurred, but without Weiss to hold him to the roof safely, it was much bumpier. And that included Pyrrha somehow sticking herself to the metal train car, in order to save Oscar's life. Both Pyrrha and Blake were very confronted by the reincarnation aspect of the fable, especially Pyrrha, who threw even more accusations at Oz. Cinder's return to Salem went as poorly as could be expected, and now she, Mercury, and Emerald have been sent on a separate mission to focus solely on the relic, while Watts and Tyrion go to do their thing in Atlas as a whole. Not to mention, it seems like Salem may have selected a replacement should Cinder fail again. Some insecurities of Yang seem to have bubbled to the surface, but it seems like maybe finally she and Blake have done some reconciling. What happens next? Only time will tell. If you've made it this far, again, please leave us a like and subscribe and leave a comment and share it if you can. It means a lot, and obviously it's been a long time coming. So let's talk about everything else aside from the episode. So yeah, it's been a year. Like I said, I don't know if anyone will even watch this episode, if there's anyone left at this point, but I thought I should address why it's been so long just in case. Usually I hide all the details of making a story so as not to give spoilers, but in this case I'll just come out and say the reason is that the end of Volume 8 meant I sort of had to pause, and then Volume 9 really threw a spanner in the works, and this is sort of how it works. At the end of Volume 8 they all fall, and that meant I sort of wanted to stop because I couldn't plan too far ahead because I didn't know how important those who fell would be. I didn't know how it was going to be structured, I didn't know what those people would do or learn when they fell. I didn't know how important it would be that I weave that into the story. And then when Volume 9 happened, it meant I really don't know what to do anymore. There's nothing wrong with Volume 9, like Volume 9 is fine, but it only works in that scenario and it kind of breaks everything in what ifs. Let me explain. If different people fall, it kind of ruins everything. The whole point of this series is that we're trying to find out what would happen if things changed, rather than just writing basically fanfiction. So let's say in the scenario Pyrrha doesn't fall because she's a better fighter or other scenarios, whatever. Well, then everything breaks. I'm not sure what I would conclude, but let's just say we did conclude that, well, if no one falls in Jean's place, then there is no Rusted Knight, then that fairy tale never existed through history, then everything is changed. Or the fairy tale is totally different, or maybe no one ever escaped ever after to begin with, so we don't have anything to know about it, and then no one has anything to follow. What do the team follow when they get there? How do they know anything? Plus, also, we still don't know confirmation of theories like if Ozpin was involved or any of that. So if there's no Rusted Knight, and even if they do escape, then the story's still different, and it still changes everything. Or you could just say, we'll just have Pyrrha fall then, and maybe I would, I'm not sure yet. But if I did, it would just feel like I'm just turning her into Jean, which isn't the point of this. And the same if I had anyone else fall, like Nora fell. The people would act differently. So even if Pyrrha falls, or someone like Nora, something wouldn't be the same. So would they go to the time tree, do the same thing, go back the same amount of time? Would everything still happen? Probably not. And then even if I hand wave it and say it all does happen the same way, they would act differently in the Ever After. And trying to figure out how all of the Ever After works and plan out probably entirely new places we've never seen because people would act differently and try different things, and trying to work within the unclear rules of Ever After, how all the time looping and things like that work, is very difficult. And it would end up being basically rewriting and fanfiction writing the whole thing and constructing a volume from scratch, and that's kind of beyond the scope of what I plan to do. And then the next question is, well, let's say no one falls. No one falls and we just go on an adventure through Remnant somehow. Well, we don't know where we're ending up except for Evacuo, I guess, but we don't really know what's happened in the world since then or how long it's been yet. And also, if no one falls, we don't know what would happen if they don't get that information about the brothers, which doesn't really seem too useful right now, but probably will end up being so. So if they don't have that, and that's key to them winning, then everyone loses in the end anyway. Plus, then they wouldn't have a way for Ruby to find out about the stuff with Summer and Raven, which seems like it's going to be really important. I can invent a way, or we can do a different way, but it's going to feel probably forced as well. But the point is, to try and keep it going is starting to feel contrived at that point, where it's moving beyond what a what-if is, and just moves again into fanfiction and just writing whatever. So basically, if things change, it breaks everything, so what's the point? And if things don't change, then nothing changes, and what's the point? So I'm kind of unsure what to do about it. I still don't know. For now, the plan is I'm going to try and go up to at least the start of Volume 8. After that, I'd need to start planning ahead to how people end up in Volume 9, so I'm not sure if I would do Volume 8, but I at least want to get through Volume 7 and deal with some of the things we've set up and some of the cool stuff, and at least go on that bit of the journey. I do still really enjoy writing these. I don't want to stop necessarily, but I've just come to this impasse where I don't know how to proceed. Because even in a different run, we'd end up at the same place at the same problem. How do we get to Ever After? How do we do the Ever After things? And does that involve me just rewriting the entirety of Ever After and probably forgetting something? Because otherwise we get to the point where I'm basically just writing my own show and it's not a RWBY run anymore, and I'm just forcing new characters to do the same thing others did. And that's not a what if, that's just railroading. So I don't really know what to do. I don't have a great solution, but I do love doing the runs and I do like this idea. And I want to go a little bit further, but I'm still unsure. So honestly, let me know what you think of this episode if you've made it this far, of course. I want to know what you think of the run and if you're still with me after all this time. And let me know if you have any ideas of what to do in the future, because I'm all ears, because I don't really know right now. But either way, I hope you enjoyed. And until next time, my name is Riggo. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining me once again, and I hope I did alright.